The snow had started falling by the time I turned off the highway onto the gravel road leading up to the cabin. It was the kind of wet, heavy snow we get in November in northern Ontario, the kind that sticks to everything and makes the birch trees look like they've been painted white. I wasn't supposed to be there. My plan had been to drive straight through to my brother's place in Sudbury. But the weather was getting worse, and I figured I'd stop for the night. Maybe get the wood stove going, sleep in my own bed for once. I had bought that cabin 41 years ago with my wife, Margaret. We found it through a listing in the back of a local paper, 12 acres. A dock on the lake, a fieldstone fireplace that smoked a little in the wrong wind. Margaret fell in love with it the moment she stepped onto the porch and saw the water through the trees. She said it felt like the whole world got quiet out there. She was right. It always did. Margaret passed away 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, I couldn't bring myself to sell the cabin, even though my son kept gently suggesting I might want to consider it. Too much maintenance for one person, he said. Too far from the city. He wasn't wrong. But he wasn't right either. That cabin was the last place that still felt like her. I wasn't ready to let it go. I came around the last bend in the road and stopped. There was a truck parked in the driveway, a dark gray pickup, fairly new, Ontario plates. I sat there with my engine running and the wipers going, looking at it. It wasn't my son's truck. His was older, a lighter color. I didn't recognize this one at all. My first thought was that someone had pulled in to wait out the snow. It happens in that area, people get turned around on the back roads. I wasn't alarmed. I put my truck in park, left the headlights on, and got out. I walked up to the front door and noticed right away that the lights were on inside. The curtains were drawn across the front window, but I could see the warm glow of the lamp behind them. The lamp I had bought at a shop in Huntsville the summer before Margaret died. She had picked it out herself. I didn't knock. It was my cabin. I put my key in the lock and opened the door. My daughter-in-law was standing in the kitchen. She was wearing a sweater I didn't recognize. There was a man sitting at the kitchen table, the table Margaret and I had refinished together the winter of 1987, the one with the ring stain from her coffee mug that I could never quite sand out all the way. He was maybe 40, dark hair, wearing a fleece vest. He looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as someone who has just realized they have made a very serious miscalculation. My daughter-in-law said my name, just once, quietly. I looked at her. I looked at him. I looked at the 2 wine glasses on the counter and the open bottle beside them. I looked at the coat thrown over the back of Margaret's reading chair by the window, the one she used to curl up in with her mystery novels on winter evenings. Someone else's coat, on her chair. I said, "I'll wait outside." I went back to my truck. I turned off the headlights. I sat in the dark with the snow coming down on the windshield, and I thought about my son. I thought about how hard he had worked over the past several years building up his landscaping business. I thought about the 2 grandchildren, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6, who called me every Sunday evening and asked me when I was coming to visit. I thought about how my daughter-in-law had cried at Margaret's funeral, standing beside my son with her arm through his, and I had thought at the time that she was a good woman. I had thought he was lucky. I sat in that truck for a long time, long enough for the snow to cover the windshield almost completely, long enough for the man in the fleece vest to come out the front door, walk quickly to his truck without looking in my direction, start it up, and drive away down the road. I watched his taillights disappear into the snow. Then I went back inside. My daughter-in-law was sitting at the kitchen table. The wine glasses were gone. The bottle was gone. She had done her best to make the room look ordinary in the few minutes she had. I had to give her credit for the instinct, even if it didn't change anything. I sat down across from her. I didn't take off my coat. She started talking before I could say anything. She said it wasn't what it looked like. Then she said it was complicated. Then she said my son didn't understand her the way he used to. The words came out in a rush, one after another, like she had been rehearsing them without knowing she'd ever need them. She said she hadn't meant for it to happen. She said she was sorry that I had to see this. Not sorry that it was happening, sorry that I had seen it. I noticed that. I asked her one question. I asked her how long. She looked at the table. She said a few months. I nodded. I stood up. I told her I needed to think, and that I would be sleeping in the back bedroom. I told her she could take the pull-out in the living room, or she could drive back to the city, but that either way I didn't want to speak any more that night. She said, "Please don't tell him." I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. I lay there in the dark listening to the snow against the window, and I thought about what she had asked me. Please don't tell him. I understood the impulse. I even had a moment, a brief one, where I wondered if I should stay out of it entirely. They were adults. Their marriage was their business. Maybe there were things I didn't know. Maybe my son had his own failings I hadn't seen. But then I thought about the truck in my driveway. I thought about the man at Margaret's table. I thought about her coat on Margaret's chair. I thought about my grandchildren sleeping in their beds in the city. A 9-year-old and a 6-year-old who had no idea that the ground under their family was hollow. And I thought about something else. Something that had been nagging at me for the better part of 6 months. Something I hadn't been able to put my finger on. My son had called me in the spring, worried. He said some money had gone missing from their joint account. Not a small amount, somewhere around $14,000 over about 5 months, withdrawn in increments small enough that he might not have noticed each one individually, but large enough that when he finally sat down with the statements, it added up to something that stopped him cold. He said he was sure there was a reasonable explanation. He said maybe there was a billing error, or maybe he had forgotten about some expense. He sounded like a man trying very hard to convince himself that the thing he was afraid of wasn't true. I had told him to look into it carefully. He said he would. He never mentioned it again, and I didn't push, because I didn't want to plant a seed that might not need planting. Now, lying in the dark in that back bedroom, I understood where $14,000 had gone. In the morning, the snow had stopped. My daughter-in-law was gone. She had left a note on the counter that said only, "I'm sorry." 2 words. I folded it and put it in my coat pocket. I spent 2 days at the cabin. I needed the time. I split firewood for a few hours each morning, which is something I do when I need to think. There is something about the physical work of it, the weight of the maul, the clean crack of the wood that sorts things out in my mind. By the second evening, I knew what I was going to do, and more importantly, I knew what I was not going to do. I was not going to call my son and tell him over the phone. That was not a conversation a man should have on a phone call while he's driving between job sites in the middle of the week. I was not going to do nothing, because doing nothing would make me complicit in something that was costing my son money he had worked for and trust he had given freely. And I was not going to go to my daughter-in-law first, because I had already seen what she did with the opportunity, to be honest. But before I did anything else, I needed one piece of information. I knew the make and model of the gray truck. I had looked at it carefully that first night. Before I went inside, I had the first 3 characters of the plate number. I had seen them in my headlights. And they stayed with me the way things do when your mind knows something matters, before you consciously do. I didn't have the full plate, but I had enough to start. I have a neighbor 3 properties down from the cabin, a retired OPP officer named Gerald, who has lived on that lake for 30 years. We have had many slow conversations over his fence about firewood and weather and the state of the roads. I drove over and knocked on his door. I told him I had a situation, and I needed some guidance. I didn't ask him to run a plate. I asked him who I might speak to if I wanted to follow up on a vehicle that had been on my property without permission. Gerald is a careful man. He asked me a few questions. I answered them honestly. He thought for a moment. Then he told me there were legal ways to pursue it, and he walked me through them. He also mentioned, in the way that older men sometimes mention things, that a newer gray Silverado, with a partial plate matching what I'd described, was registered in a name he recognized someone from a town about 40 minutes south who ran a small contracting company. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. I thanked him. I drove back to the cabin. That night I did something I am not particularly proud of, but which I do not regret. I looked up the contracting company online. The website had a staff page. There was a photo of the owner, the man from my kitchen table, named and smiling, with a brief biography that mentioned he had been operating in the region for 12 years and that he lived locally with his family. His family. I looked for a few more minutes. I found enough. He was married. There was a wife. From what I could piece together, she had no idea. I closed the laptop. I made a cup of tea. I sat with it until it went cold. Here's the thing people don't understand about being in your 60s and finding yourself in the middle of someone else's crisis. You've already been through enough of your own that the sharp edges are familiar. The shock passes faster. What takes longer is the grief not for yourself, but for the people who are going to get hurt no matter which way this goes. My son, his children, the wife of the man I had never met until he was sitting at my dead wife's kitchen table. She deserved to know. I believed that then, and I believe it now. Not because of any satisfaction it gave me, there was none, but because she was building her life on the same broken ground my son was, and she had the same right he did to know the truth about it. I found her contact information. It took a while. I am not a man who is comfortable with the internet, but I have a granddaughter who taught me more than I expected over a few patient Sunday afternoons. I found a listing, a local community organization she was involved with, a phone number. I wrote out what I was going to say on a piece of paper first. I kept it short. I said who I was. I said what I had found. I told her I was sorry to be the one calling, and that I had no interest in causing harm, only in making sure she had information she deserved to have. I gave her my phone number, and I told her she could call me back if she had questions. Then I called. She answered on the third ring. I said what I had written down. There was a long silence on the other end. Then she asked me to repeat the name of my daughter-in-law. I did. There was another silence. Then she said, very quietly, that she had suspected something for a while but hadn't known how to confirm it. She thanked me. Her voice was steady in the way that people's voices get when they are using everything they have to hold themselves together. We spoke for about 12 minutes. I told her what I had seen. I did not editorialize. I did not tell her what to do with the information. When we finished, she thanked me again and we said goodbye. I sat for a while. Then I called my son. I told him I needed to see him in person and that it was important. He heard something in my voice. He knows me well enough. And he said he would come to the cabin that weekend. I said good. I said I would have the wood stove going and that he should bring his winter coat. He arrived Saturday morning. He came in, stomped the snow off his boots, and accepted the cup of coffee I handed him. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table, the one with Margaret's coffee ring, and I told him what I had found. I told him about the truck in the driveway and the man in the fleece vest. I told him about the $14,000 and what I believed had happened to it. I told him about the call I had made, and to whom, and why. He was quiet for a long time. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked out the window at the lake, where the ice was just starting to form along the edges of the dock. He said, "How long have you known?" I said, 6 days. He nodded slowly. He said, "You should have called me right away." I said, "Maybe. But I needed to know what I was bringing you first." He didn't argue with that. He is a practical man. He gets it from his mother. We sat together for most of that day. We talked about a lot of things, and some things we didn't talk about at all, which is also something we learned from Margaret. In the late afternoon, we put on our coats and walked out to the dock and stood there looking at the lake and the tree line and the gray winter sky. A loon called somewhere out across the water late in the season for it. They should have been gone weeks ago, but there it was. My son said, "She asked me this morning why I wanted to talk. I told her it was about money." I said, "Is that what it's about?" He thought for a moment. He said, "It's about everything." He hired a family lawyer in January. A good one, recommended by a colleague of mine who had used her years ago. The financial irregularities were well documented. The bank statements went back almost 8 months, and the pattern was clear. In the end, that piece of it mattered considerably in how things were structured. My son was awarded primary custody of both children. His daughter's school schedule wouldn't be disrupted. His son was already registered in hockey for the winter and stayed in his program. Those things mattered. My daughter-in-law's access was limited and supervised for a period, at the lawyer's recommendation, given the totality of the circumstances. I know that is a point some people would dispute. I understand the argument. She was their mother regardless of what she had done as a wife. But the financial deception, the deliberate pattern of it over many months, raised questions about judgment that the court took seriously. I was not the one who decided that. I only told the truth when I was asked to. My son is doing all right. He is not doing perfectly, but he is doing all right, which at this point is more than enough. The children are with him. They call me on Sunday evening still, the boy and the girl, and they ask me when I am coming to visit. I tell them soon. I mean it. I was up at the cabin again last month, February, which is the coldest it gets up there, the kind of cold that makes the trees crack at night and turns the lake into a solid sheet you could drive a car across. I went out to the dock in the evening and stood there in the dark for a while, the way I sometimes do. I thought about Margaret. I thought about the first winter we spent there, when the furnace went out and we slept by the fireplace, and she said it was the most comfortable she'd been in years. I thought about how she used to sit in that reading chair by the window with a blanket over her knees and her glasses sliding down her nose, so absorbed in whatever she was reading that she wouldn't hear me come in from outside. The coat is gone now. I put it in a bag and left it at the donation bin in town. I moved the reading chair to face the fireplace instead of the window. Small things, but the cabin still feels like her. It still goes quiet in a way nowhere else does. I am not a man who believes in holding on to anger. It is too heavy to carry and it does not keep you warm. But I am also not a man who looks away when someone I love is being deceived. Margaret raised our son. She refinished that table. She chose that lamp. She sat in that chair and read her books and loved that lake and loved us. And she deserved better than to have her home treated like it was nothing. So did my son. So did those two children. I did what I thought was right. I would do it again.